Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, I want to thank the people at the Stiftung for inviting me to talk about this issue. So I'm going to give my own personal views of an approach to Shi'i religious studies and comparative theology. Both religious studies and comparative theology both arise from particular needs of academia. Religious studies departments in the US have often been a product of the need for a secular alternative to theology departments, when theology could not receive government funding. And as a result, religious studies at many universities often consisted of secularized versions of what had been taught as Christian theology, with various additions and modifications. Comparative theology, on the other hand, is a new area of study, and it's supported in theology departments, especially in Europe, where a need is recognized for addressing non-Christian religious traditions in a manner that serves as an alternative to theologies of religion in which religious traditions are considered to be equally valid, as in popular forms of religious pluralism. The history of religious studies as an academic field is also not that old. It can be traced back to the late 19th century, although the study of religions can be found in the literary traditions of many cultures from antiquity to the present. Religious studies only became an accepted curriculum of the university study, when you could not only take courses in religious studies, but you could also major in religious studies. This started in the 1960s, when it was introduced as an alternative to theological approaches to religion, and was often advertised as providing a dispassionate scientific approach to religion, in contrast to the advocacy of religious belief characteristic of Christian theology. Now, since that time, critical approaches to the concept of religious studies have been articulated in an increasing number of books and articles, especially over the last 20 years or so. And often these criticisms draw on post-colonial studies. And here are some examples of people who have been very critical of the very concept of religious studies. Is Timothy Fitzgerald, whose book, The Ideology of Religious Studies, takes a very harsh stance against the entire field. But Talal Assad, who's working at the City University of New York, has also made critical remarks about the field. The subfields of religious studies are not only different areas of study within the broader field, they also designate different approaches to the field as a whole. For example, according to some authors, religious studies is primarily the sociological or anthropological study of religious phenomena in various societies or among different peoples, while others identify religious studies with what used to be called the history of religions or comparative religion. So the subfields, if you replace in the phrase X of religion, X could be anthropology, economics, geography, history, legal studies, literary studies, philosophy, psychology, sociology, and all of them have a place, for some authors at least, within the field of religious studies. Now we come to the question of what would a Shi'i religious studies be? The very idea of having a Shi'i religious studies might seem like a contradiction in terms, because religious studies is supposed to take a neutral stance with respect to religious differences, rather than to advocate any religious denomination. However, we may consider three different ways in which religious studies may appropriately be called Shi'i. First, we can restrict religious studies to studies of religion among the Shia, including all the subfields mentioned in the previous slide. So here we have a subject-specific kind of Shiite studies, where people want to study the history of Shi'ism or the role that the Shiite religion plays in various societies and things like that. The second kind of Shiite religious studies that I'd like to consider is the review of discussions of issues that are prominent in religious studies today as found in Shiite literature, including tafsir, prose and poetry, jurisprudence, biographies, histories, philosophy, mysticism or erfan, collections of narrations, etc. And here the point would be to systematize statements on issues of academic religious studies as they are found in Shiite sources. So we could call this a topical approach to Shiite studies. Some of the notable topics include the following, and this is just what I get from looking at our various anthologies on religious studies: the origins of religion, how to define religion, magic, religious practices and rituals, religion and modernity, social functions of religious institutions, Islamic economics, religious authority, the psychology of religion, gender, Orientalism, new religious movements, religion and the environment, religion and animals, religious diaspora, spirituality, and the list goes on and on. And in any of these topics that are standardly discussed under the heading of religious studies, we could ask, for example, what can we find in the Shiite tradition of some century or some geographical area about these issues? Now, this kind of Shiite religious studies, the topical one, and also the subject-specific kind of religious studies that I mentioned before, could be practiced in a purely descriptive way. There's no advocacy going on here. This is just a scientific study of religion, either limited to the Shia, looking at religious phenomena in the Shia world, or looking at what Shia sources of various kind have to say about different topics that come up in religious studies. The third kind of Shiite religious studies is a more controversial one. Religious studies as Shiite Islamic social science. Although the field of religious studies pretends to be value neutral, critics argue otherwise. Like all cultural phenomena, the phenomena of religious studies reflects the values of the societies in which it has emerged. An approach to religious studies will be Islamic, and more particularly Shi'i, when it draws upon the values and theological assumptions of Shia Islam, as it carries forward inquiries about the religions of the world. And so I'll refer to this as Islamic Shiite religious studies. So now we have three kinds: this Islamicized kind of religious studies, which lots of people will be very much opposed to. And then there's the topical kind and the subject-specific kind. One of the reasons for opposition is due to the objection that Shiite studies, in this sense of Islamicized Shiite studies, will fail to be objective. It won't be scientific. It's a return to the kind of theological commitment that religious studies departments were established in order to avoid. And I think that an answer can be given to this criticism, that objectivity can be regained by making the assumptions explicit. So instead of arguing, for example, that the Quran is the word of God that was revealed to the prophet, and making this this statement part of what's supposed to be religious studies, instead you could say, well, assuming that that claim is true, what would follow from this, and how have people interpreted this? Now, Islamic Shiite religious studies, or Islamic religious studies, I should say, is a part of the project of Islamic social sciences. And a number of Muslim authors have advocated the development of Islamic social sciences. Sometimes this is seen as part of a general Islamization of knowledge, while others focus on the social sciences and humanities as being particularly biased by assumptions contrary to Islam. The term Islamization of knowledge was first introduced in 1978 by Sayyid Muhammad Naqib al-Attas in Malaysia. And given that religious studies is generally considered to be included in the social sciences, the project of the Islamization of knowledge will also include the Islamicization of religious studies. A rival approach to the Islamicization of knowledge was initiated by Ismail Faruqi in 1982. And this approach was integrated with several other goals, including the reform of Islam, the salvation of the West, and a substantive view about how the modern sciences were to be Islamized. Faruqi proposed to adopt the best of Western science and technology, but to base it on Islamic principles and values that would guide the further development of the sciences. Yet another call for the Islamization of knowledge may be derived from the works of Sayyid Hussein Nasr, although he calls his project one of reviving the sacred sciences rather than Islamization, and emphasizes the idea that the religious traditions of the world share a perennial wisdom opposed to the cultural and intellectual trends that emerged from European modernity. Nasr calls for a return to sacred science in a number of his writings, most prominently in his Knowledge and the Sacred and the Need for Sacred Science, although his position was stated as early as 1957. And there have been many other proposals for the Islamicization of the social sciences. Various proposals continue to be debated across the Muslim world. These proposals are generally found in the context of debates about the social sciences and humanities and about the relation between science and religion. Oddly enough, religious studies have not been a focus of attention in these discussions. My own home institution, the Imam Khomeini Education and Research Institute, was established with the express purpose of promotion of Islamic sciences as advocated by its founder, the late Allame Misbah Yazdi. May Allah bless his soul. Issues related to the development of religious studies have also been discussed in various publications by William Chittick. First, Chittick says that an Islamic hermeneutics will only develop through the recovery of Islamic intellectual sciences, the exclusive focus of Muslims on the transmitted sciences and on a politics of Islamic identity has inhibited the the ability of Muslims to think for themselves and apply their intellects to finding the haq, the truth of things in the world and in themselves. And Islamic hermeneutics must be based on the awareness that the sort of understanding provided by its interpretations is no mere accumulation of facts whose aim is control over objects. Rather, its aim is wisdom, and wisdom goes beyond what is considered knowledge in the prevalent scientific worldview. The rejection of scientism and the recognition that one's understanding cannot simply be taken over from some textual source by imitation are also characteristics of the hermeneutic tradition. So a question comes, can Islamic Shi'i religious studies be scientific? If science is objectifying inquiry and the interpretation of religion cannot be an objectifying inquiry, it would seem that a scientific approach to religious studies would be impossible, and hence that there could be no Islamic religious studies as a scientific discipline. Our suggestion is that the objectivity of interpretive inquiry can be preserved through the articulation of one's assumptions. The idea that any hermeneutics must begin from one's own perspective does not imply that this perspective cannot itself be articulated and subject to critical examination. Hermeneutics is the study of interpretation and understanding. Although unfortunately this study has sometimes been associated with perniciously relativistic views because of misinterpretations of Gadamer from my perspective, there's nothing about hermeneutics in the general sense outlined here that requires this. The project of nurturing sacred or Islamicized approaches to religious studies is essentially a hermeneutical project, for it requires the reinterpretation and renewed understanding of religious studies from an explicitly Islamic perspective, which can more specifically be Shiite. Now, I want to compare what's gone on in the case of religious studies with comparative theology. So we have religious studies, which sometimes used to be called comparative religion, and now there's this new field, comparative theology. As a field of academic studies, religious studies is currently more often used than the older comparative religion. Religious studies should not be confused with comparative theology, to which we turn next. Comparative theology is a recent area of academic study. It's still in the process of consolidating itself as a field, and there are various ideas about what it really is. A relatively clear definition is given by James Fredericks. Not only a revisionist, but also a constructive project in which theologians interpret the meaning and truth of one tradition by making critical correlations with the classics of another religious tradition. The prominent idea among those who advocate the study of comparative theology is that it is theology, and theology is generally taken to imply that those engaged in it are committed religious believers. Second, it involves a reinterpretation of the theologian's own tradition in the light of one or more other religious traditions. So the aim is not just finding similarities and differences among traditions, but employing what is learned about other traditions in order to enrich one's own. And here are a few books that have been influential in the field of comparative theology, and it's not to be confused with comparative religion. So there's this book, Comparative Religion for Dummies, for example, which I don't recommend, but it just talks about the origins of the Abrahamic faiths for the most part. Comparative theology has been developed by Christian theologians, especially Catholics, like Francis X. Cluny, who's a Jesuit, and Klaus von Stosch, who's at the University of Bonn now, but spent a number of years at Paderborn While comparative theology has been advocated as an enhancement to Christian theology, it's also been recommended for theologians of other faiths. Thus, comparative theologies may be understood as frameworks for theological research programs in which aspects or items drawn from different religious traditions are compared, including a spectrum with the following markers. First, we have Catholic comparative theology, comparative work grounded in a commitment to an affirmation of Catholic theology. Then there are alternative comparative theologies, which are like Catholic comparative theology, but grounded in a non-Catholic theology, which could be Protestant or Islamic or something else. And finally, there's non-denominational comparative theologies, which are like the first two, but without grounding in any specific denominationally authoritative theological tradition. And they can be generic, or they could be grounded in multiple traditions. Religious studies goes beyond comparative theology because there's supposed to be no theological commitment at all in religious studies. Although the Islamicization of religious studies might contribute to the development of Islamic comparative theology. So it seems like there's no place for an Islamicized religious studies in the current academic framework of religious studies, because religious studies is supposed to be secular. And the whole point of Islamicized social sciences was to sacralize or desecularize the social sciences. Now, my suggestion, this is my own personal suggestion, is a free theology. Comparative theologies, whether Christian, Muslim, or non-denominational, are considered to be subfields of theology. And in many universities in Europe, to teach theology, one must have the approval of the relevant religious authorities. Religious studies, on the other hand, is often promoted as the scientific study of religious phenomena, and as such is considered to be essentially secular. Given this distinction, there would be no place for Islamic Shi'i religious studies. Shi'i religious studies could be subject specific, or it could be topical, but the Islamicization of religious studies would remove it from religious studies as understood in Western academia and place it in the category of theology. An important question that Muslim researchers must address is whether they are willing to accept the division that's predominant in the world's universities today. Questions of theological interest may be addressed independent of one's religious allegiance. Likewise, the methods employed by theologians are not off limits to non-believers. Theological research, independent of the approval of church authorities or other religious institutions, could be called free theology. Likewise, we could define free religious studies to be religious studies without the requirement of neutrality. Since comparative theology is still in a formative stage, the opportunity presents itself for the development of Islamic comparative theologies as free theologies might take as their models the discussions of religious issues which the Shiite imams, peace be with them, participated. And there are numerous narrations in which the imams, peace be with them, had conversations with others who didn't believe at all. In terms of the politics of whether in universities, the suggestion here is that Islamic theology and Islamic studies may be combined if freed from the requirements of religious commitment or of neutrality. That should be mortality. An Islamic Institute for Islamic Studies by Germany, for example, studies Islam Wissenschaft to Islam Studien. Islamic Studies examines Islam in a way not intervene in inter-Islamic discussions about religious truths, end quote. Thus, Islamic studies is on the model of religious studies as a secular science. This commitment, modeled on the idea of church authority to designate who's entitled to teach theology in the universities. The suggestion here is that Muslims should take advantage of the fact that we do not belong to a church to fuse together Islamic studies and Islamic theology without any insider-outsider requirements. Comparative methods. Third, the evaluation directions for further research. The aim of understanding for free Shi'i religious studies and comparative theologies should be to deepen understanding of beliefs and practices of the Shia, of other Muslims, and not of other religions or those who have no religion at all.
I'm sorry, Dr. Legenhausen, could you hear
religious
me?
Studies and comparative theologies. Yes.
I'm so sorry.
Yes,
we cannot hear you correctly. We cannot hear you correctly. Could you please turn off your camera? Because I think your internet has a problem. When you
yes, okay.
turn off your camera,
that's
we can hear you better.
Just a minute. Okay, I will do it. I will do it. To do this. There is the camera off. Okay. Better? Okay.
I think that will be better, but we will test it again.
Should I continue?
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Now it's clear.
Okay, good. And I lost the spot where I was. Just a minute. Yes, here. If we look at comparative studies in areas outside of religion, we find that there's comparative literature, comparative philosophy, comparative political theory, historique croisée, cross-cultural studies, comparative law, and none of these require any particular neutral status on the part of those who teach or profess these fields. There's no insider-outsider problem assumed in comparative political theory. So we don't have a special field for those who are advocating socialism as insiders, as opposed to an objective social science approach to the study of socialism as a phenomenon in history or whatever. And I'm claiming that we should have the same approach to comparative studies with regard to religion. With respect to the evaluation of results, theological assertions, reasonable as challenges to theological assertions are answered by providing reasons. And reasons, in turn, are evaluated with respect to epistemic norms, including general logic and linguistic norms, and epistemically relevant practical and evidential norms. Shiite religious studies and comparative theologies will examine and compare the assertions and the norms governing them in their own contexts. And this can be done in a descriptive way as well, by asking how do people in Shiite theological circles reason theologically, what presuppositions, what norms do they use? And finally, I'd like to make several suggestions for research in the epistemology of comparative theologies. One is the issue of trust. When is trust warranted and when should it be withheld? This issue can be raised within the context of religious studies as traditionally conceived by looking at how religious communities trust or distrust other communities, and it can also be looked at from the point of view of Islamic Shiite studies by asking what positions does Shi'ism suggest about when trust should be offered and when it should be withheld. Second is the issue of intellectual virtue. We can ask how the intellectual virtues are understood in different theological traditions. And again, this can... And again, this can be done independent of whether somebody's taking an insider or outsider point of view with regard to religious commitment. Third is the study of religious reasons themselves. How are religious reasons identified in different theological traditions, and what are the governing norms relevant to them? And in each of these cases, I've tried to give put some covers of books that discuss relevant issues. So in summation, Shiite religious studies and comparative theologies may be carried out in three different ways. First, by focusing on Shiite religious phenomena. And then for comparative theology, this would mean focusing on Shiite religious phenomena in relation to, for example, Catholic religious phenomena or some other faith. Or topically, by taking specific issues like economics or gender and asking how these topics are treated in Shiite theology or by specific Shiite thinkers and comparing that with how it's treated in other traditions. And third, by using a Shiite religious hermeneutics, which can be elaborated in accordance with different programs for sacred, religious, or Islamicized sciences. And there are a number of different views about how that should be done, and I'm not taking a stance on any of this right now, but I've written elsewhere about different levels of hermeneutic study. So one way that the study that a Shiite religious hermeneutics could be promoted is by taking a phenomenological approach. How does the theological topic affect one's own religious life? How is that seen from the inside? Another would be by taking a look at the vocabularies that are used. With what vocabularies are we to describe and analyze religious phenomena? And there are other alternatives about this issue as well. I've suggested that Shiite religious studies and comparative theologies should be conducted without requirements for neutrality, and also without requirements for any apologetic stance, as free from such requirements that are often assumed for religious studies and theology. Accordingly, there would be a difference between some kinds of Shiite comparative, there would be no difference between some kinds of Shiite comparative religious studies and comparative theologies. Finally, I've suggested several tasks ahead for the development of Shiite religious studies and comparative theologies, including the identification of aims, critical review of the methodologies used, the evaluation of theological claims, and programs for further research within these fields. Thank you for your attention.